The heat of a Kansas summer pressed against the horizon when the convoy of buses pulled into the small town. Inside sat rows of Japanese prisoners of war, their khaki uniforms faded from camp life, their eyes restless. For years they had lived with scarcity, bowls of thin rice, worn clothing patched again and again, lives narrowed by war and defeat. Yet on this day, as guards opened the doors and ordered them to step outside, the men found themselves facing a building unlike anything they had ever seen. Bright windows stretched wide across its facade, sunlight reflecting off polished glass. Beyond the doors lay a space that seemed to hum with impossible abundance. It was an American supermarket in 1945, and for men raised in rationing and hunger, the sight would shake their sense of reality. The first sensory shock was light. Inside, the ceiling blazed with fluorescent bulbs, brighter than many villages in wartime Japan had ever seen. Shelves stretched in straight, endless lines, each one stacked from floor to eye level with goods. There was no dust, no darkness, no shortage. The air itself carried smells that collided in dizzying waves. Fresh bread, coffee, oranges, soap, even tobacco. For men accustomed to the stale odor of barracks and the metallic scent of war, this mixture felt intoxicating, almost unreal. The paradox struck instantly. These were prisoners, men stripped of weapons, of liberty, of pride. Yet here they stood, surrounded by luxuries their families back home had not touched in years. At home, wives queued for rice that never arrived. Children went barefoot. Elders rationed salt. Here, in the heart of the enemy's land, the shelves groaned with sugar, flour, meat, and milk. One POW whispered to another, "We lost the war to people who live like this." U.S. National Archives, 1946. Context deepened the shock. During the early 1940s, Japan had enforced strict rationing. Meat was scarce, sugar nearly unobtainable, fruit a memory. Cities had endured blackouts and shortages. In contrast, American production had not only armed millions, but also filled supermarkets for civilians. By 1944, the United States produced more than 17 million tons of food for civilian consumption, on top of military supply. In simple numbers, the abundance was staggering. German POWs had remarked on Coca-Cola and ice cream in camps. Japanese prisoners now saw something larger. A system where every ordinary citizen lived with a richness unimaginable in their homeland. The sensory detail sharpened as guards led the men inside. Cold air hit their skin. Supermarkets already used air circulation that kept temperatures steady. For prisoners used to sweat and dust, the coolness felt like a shock. The clatter of carts echoed, wheels rattling on clean floors. A child laughed as her mother reached for a box of cereal, its colors bold and cheerful. One prisoner later recalled, "It was not the weapons that defeated us. It was this, rows of food, endless and cheap." Red Cross Report, 1945. Ethical questions emerged quietly. Why had Americans shown this to prisoners? Some argued it was psychological warfare, a demonstration that no matter how fiercely Japan fought, it could not match such wealth. Others suggested it was accidental, the routine of transporting labor details through towns. Historians still debate. What is clear is that these moments became embedded in memory, told again decades later in interviews and memoirs. Numbers reinforced the lesson. By 1945, the average American consumed over 3,200 calories per day. In wartime Japan, daily rations often fell below 1,900, sometimes as low as 1,500 in urban areas. That gap was not abstract. It meant children in Osaka fainting at school, while American children drank milk with lunch. For POWs, the sight of supermarket shelves heavy with butter and cheese confirmed what statistics already suggested. They had been fighting a nation whose resources seemed infinite. The prisoners touched nothing. Guards made sure of it. But their eyes moved constantly, drinking in every detail. Cans gleamed under bright lights, labels boasting of peaches, beans, tuna, and corn. A row of hams hung behind glass, their weight almost grotesque. Bread loaves sat in neat lines, the smell warm and comforting. In one corner, oranges gleamed brighter than any flag. A Japanese officer muttered, "This is not war. This is another world." U.S. National Archives, 1946. For American civilians, the presence of POWs in town was an oddity, but not shocking. Many towns near camps were used to it. Guards escorted small groups for labor, harvesting, construction, sometimes even helping in factories. That day, however, the contrast of prisoners in faded uniforms walking through aisles of endless goods left an impression. Some children stared, whispering that these were enemy soldiers. Others barely looked, more interested in the candy counter. The contrast between ordinary life and the extraordinary eyes of men seeing abundance for the first time marked the moment. The sensory overload reached climax at the checkout counters. Cash registers rang with metallic clicks, drawers opening with speed. Coins clattered, bills exchanged hands. For prisoners who lived by camp tokens and ration slips, the flow of money seemed like a ritual of power. The very act of ordinary women paying for groceries demonstrated an economy that flowed without interruption, without scarcity. One prisoner later explained to an interviewer, "We fought with swords against a people who bought bread like this. We could not win." BBC interview, 1962. Ethical reflection sharpens at this memory. Was showing POWs such wealth humiliation or enlightenment? At the time, Japanese officers considered it deliberate psychological pressure. Decades later, historians suggest it was more subtle, a byproduct of America's normal life intruding into the experience of prisoners. Yet for the men who saw it, the lesson was seared. Abundance itself was a weapon, perhaps sharper than steel. The micro-mathematics of war proved it. America had produced not only weapons, but also civilian goods at a rate unmatched by any other power. Between 1940 and 1945, the U.S. built 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, and over 2,700 Liberty ships, while still keeping supermarket shelves filled. Japan, by contrast, had built fewer than 70,000 aircraft in total, and its people endured near starvation. For prisoners, walking through an American supermarket was like walking through the statistics of their defeat, transformed into colors and smells. The paradox burned deeper with each aisle. These were enemy soldiers, yet they now envied civilians. Their homeland demanded sacrifice unto death. Kamikaze missions flown on half-empty tanks, families starving in cities bombed nightly. America asked its people for war work, but still gave them sugar, coffee, butter, and oranges. How could Japan sustain faith in its path when ordinary Americans lived with more comfort than its generals? The prisoners left the supermarket in silence. Guards marched them back toward buses, but many turned their heads for a last glimpse at glass windows gleaming in the sun. Behind them, women pushed carts. Children licked candy. Men bought newspapers. The world moved on, normal and abundant. For the prisoners, it felt like standing at the edge of a canyon between two civilizations. In interviews decades later, former POWs recalled that day more vividly than many battles. The images haunted them: shelves of bread, bins of fruit, the cool air and bright light. They admitted the shock was not only material but cultural. They realized in that moment that Japan had misjudged its enemy. The war was not only lost on battlefields, but in stores, factories, and farms. The ethical capsule concludes, Geneva did not regulate abundance. It demanded humane treatment of prisoners, but said nothing of showing them civilian plenty. At the time, some Americans believed such glimpses would break morale and hasten acceptance of defeat. Others questioned the fairness of confronting starving men with such visions. Historians note that these moments blur the line between compassion and psychological warfare. The truth is likely both. The numbers remain the final verdict. By 1946, more than 5 million American women worked in industry, producing both weapons and consumer goods. Farm output had risen by 32% during the war. Supermarkets, only a decade old as a phenomenon, had expanded across the country. For Japanese prisoners, one visit was enough to reveal the scale of difference. They had entered a war against not only soldiers, but an entire economy geared to abundance. The buses rattled back onto the country road, dust rising behind them, But inside, the prisoners sat in silence. The memory of shelves bursting with goods clung to them more tightly than the chains on their wrists. For men raised in an island nation that had lived under rationing since 1938, the experience felt like a vision from another world. Their thoughts kept returning to the same paradox. Why did America, which spent so much of its industry on war, still have enough left to overwhelm its civilians with food and comfort? For many of the Japanese officers, the contrast cut especially deep. They had grown up in a system where the state demanded sacrifice, where rice was measured by the spoonful and clothing reused until threads broke apart. In Tokyo by 1944, average rations had fallen below 1,800 calories a day, and civilians resorted to acorns and grass mixed into their meals. The war effort consumed all. Yet in Kansas or Texas or Iowa, children still carried sandwiches to school. Stores displayed chocolate, and milk was bottled by the millions. One POW would later recall, "In that one store, I saw the explanation for the entire war." U.S. National Archives, 1946. The sensory overload lingered in their minds. They could still see the gleam of oranges piled high, something most had never seen in such quantity. They could smell roasted coffee drifting from a grinder, a luxury their families had forgotten. They remembered the coolness of the air, a relief so sharp after the sweat of summer. These sensations clashed with memories of home, dark kitchens, smoke from rationed charcoal, the sour taste of pickled vegetables eaten day after day. The human mind compared them relentlessly, and the result was despair. Numbers confirmed the truth. By 1945, the United States produced more than 24 billion pounds of meat annually, 8 billion gallons of milk, and 90 million tons of grain. Even with millions of men in uniform and oceans of supplies shipped overseas, there remained enough to stock stores across every state. Japan's agricultural output, by contrast, had plummeted. American submarines cut off imports of rice and soy from Southeast Asia. Typhoons damaged harvests. By the final year, Tokyo civilians survived on less than half the calories of their American counterparts. The supermarket shelves were not illusions. They were the front line of abundance. For the American civilians who witnessed Japanese prisoners staring at the goods, reactions were mixed. Some felt pity, seeing men whose eyes widened at candy and bread as though they were children. Others felt a grim satisfaction, a belief that showing the enemy this plenty would break their will. In letters home, one Kansas woman wrote, "I never thought the war was real until I saw those prisoners looking at our store. They looked as if they had walked into a dream they could not believe." Red Cross Report, 1945. For the prisoners, the psychological effect was profound. They had been told in propaganda that America was decadent, soft, incapable of sacrifice. Yet, here was decadence weaponized, turned into power. Abundance had become an instrument of war as decisive as bombers or tanks. The realization settled like a weight in their chests. Their nation had asked them to die for honor, while America asked its people to live with plenty. Which vision would survive the war? The sensory contrasts grew sharper the more they thought about it. One man remembered the metallic clatter of the cash register, coins ringing as though they were bells of victory. Another recalled the sound of paper bags rustling, the smell of soap and fruit mixed in the air. For weeks afterward, camp mess halls filled with conversations about that day. Men described what they had seen to those who had not gone. The images spread like rumors of another world, more powerful than any leaflet dropped from a plane. The ethical question lingers. Geneva required that prisoners be given adequate food and humane treatment, but it said nothing about showing them civilian life. Was it kindness to let them glimpse freedom and plenty, or was it cruelty, reminding them of what they lacked? Historians today argue both sides. Some call it a humane gesture, evidence of America's confidence. Others call it psychological pressure, calculated to crush morale. What cannot be denied is that for the prisoners, the supermarket became a symbol of their defeat. Numbers again reinforced their memories. By 1946, surveys showed that more than 60% of returning Japanese POWs mentioned food abundance in America as one of their lasting impressions. Many compared it unfavorably to conditions at home, where families struggled on rations of millet, barley, or sweet potatoes. The scale of American supermarkets, with aisles stretching longer than some Japanese markets entire, became legend among them. They had entered a war believing Japan's spirit could outlast American industry. In one afternoon, that illusion died. For the guards escorting them, the incident barely registered. They saw only men staring in silence, soldiers without weapons, but they could not hear the storm inside the prisoners' thoughts. Some officers admitted later that morale in the camps shifted after such trips. Men became quieter, more resigned. The supermarket had done what no battlefield could. It stripped away the last faith that Japan could win. The sensory legacy did not fade. Decades later, interviews still returned to the same images: the coolness of air, the sight of stacked bread, the smell of coffee. These details mattered more than speeches or propaganda. They were lived experiences, and they could not be argued away. One former POW explained in 1970, "We believed we fought bravely, but when I saw the shelves, I realized bravery was not enough." BBC interview, 1970. The ethical capsule closes the thought. Was it a cruelty to parade hungry men through aisles of plenty? Or was it a lesson that shortened the war by revealing reality faster than bombs could? Geneva had no answer. History still debates. What is certain is that those prisoners carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives. By the time the buses rolled back through the gates of the camp, the men's worldviews had shifted. They walked back to their barracks, ate their standard rations, but now they knew. The war was not just lost on battlefields or seas. It had been lost in places like that store, where ordinary Americans shopped while the world burned. In the weeks after their unexpected encounter with America's supermarkets, the Japanese prisoners could not let go of what they had seen. At night, in barracks, while guards patrolled the fences and cicadas sang beyond the wire, conversations circled back again and again to the images burned into memory. Some spoke of the light, fluorescent bulbs so bright they made every can shine like treasure. Others spoke of smell, coffee, sugar, soap, and oranges blending into an intoxicating air. The words returned each night, as if describing a dream too strange to be real. The paradox haunted them. They had been raised to believe that sacrifice was nobler than comfort, that shortages proved endurance, that spirit mattered more than material. Yet when faced with shelves overflowing with food, those beliefs wavered. How could a nation living in such abundance also produce fleets of bombers, carriers, and tanks? The men began to ask themselves if perhaps spirit without resources was like a sword swung into the wind. Numbers sharpened the sting. By 1945, American farms produced enough wheat to feed not only their nation, but also Allied armies and devastated Europe. Over 20 million acres were under cultivation just for wheat alone, producing more than 1 billion bushels annually. Japan, by contrast, struggled to harvest enough rice, with yields declining by nearly 30% in the last years of war. For prisoners, the math was undeniable. The supermarket was not an anomaly. It was the logical outcome of a system overflowing with production. The sensory comparisons deepened their reflections. They remembered childhoods in Japan filled with seasonal scarcity, the hunger in late winter, the joy of summer fruit, the ration tickets of wartime. Now they contrasted it with the memory of aisles where fruit sat year-round, where bread was always fresh, where sugar was not rationed but sold in bags larger than anything their families had seen. One man admitted decades later, "The war ended, for me, the day I saw an American child eating chocolate casually, as if it were rice." U.S. National Archives, 1946. For American civilians, the incident barely registered. Few realized that their everyday abundance was itself a weapon of persuasion. Mothers shopping for flour did not imagine that enemy soldiers were watching, recalculating their entire worldview. Yet the impact was profound. The POWs did not simply see goods, they saw the foundations of power. Tanks rust, planes crash. But a society that can flood shelves with food can flood battlefields with steel. Ethical reflections emerge slowly. Was it right for America to display such wealth before hungry men? Some guards later recalled feeling uneasy, watching the prisoners' eyes linger too long on the candy counter. Others argued it was justice. These men had fought for an empire that had inflicted suffering across Asia. Why should they be shielded from reality? Historians now suggest the supermarket encounter worked as a silent lecture, a lesson in economics more powerful than propaganda leaflets. The sensory memory spread like contagion. Men who had not gone into town heard the stories and embellished them. Soon, in camp lore, the supermarket became myth. It was said the shelves stretched forever, that meat was stacked to the ceiling, that ice cream lay in bins waiting for children. Each retelling made the vision larger. Reality and memory blurred, but the impact was the same. Abundance had destroyed illusions of parity. Numbers again sealed the impression. American per capita consumption of sugar in 1945 was nearly 95 pounds per year. In Japan, it had fallen to less than 5. Milk consumption in the U.S. exceeded 200 quarts per person annually, while in Japan, many children had never tasted it. These statistics, whispered from Red Cross reports and camp rumors, reinforced what their eyes had seen. The gap was not just wide, it was unbridgeable. For Japanese officers, the humiliation was sharper. They had sworn to die for the emperor, convinced of Japan's destiny. Yet now, stripped of weapons, they realized that their families back home queued for barley while American children sipped sodas. One officer confessed in a post-war interview, "The shelves of that store taught me more than any defeat on the battlefield." BBC interview, 1965. The ethical capsule sharpens again here. Was showing POWs such things cruelty, mocking their hunger or enlightenment, forcing them to accept the war's futility. Geneva said nothing of abundance. It required humane treatment, but abundance turned into spectacle was beyond its pages. Historians argue both ways, yet for the prisoners, it felt undeniable. They had fought against a world so wealthy it could treat luxuries as ordinary. The sensory record of longing colored daily life afterward. Camp rations, bread, beans, sometimes meat, suddenly looked different. Men ate in silence, remembering the supermarket's abundance. They spoke less of returning home victorious and more of whether their homeland could ever match such plenty. The paradox of being a prisoner in a land of freedom and excess weighed on every meal. Numbers once more made the point. American war production had peaked in 1944, producing 96,000 aircraft and 29,000 tanks that year alone. Yet civilian production did not collapse. Factories built both bombers and washing machines, both tanks and canned peaches. Japan could produce fighters, but its people starved. America produced both victory and comfort. The supermarket was proof in glass and steel. By winter of 1945, as news of Japan's defeat spread, the prisoners remembered the supermarket more than the battlefield. Each Allied advance was measured not only in miles, but in the shadow of American abundance. They knew then that surrender was inevitable. Spirit without bread could not win. Winter came and the camps grew colder. Snow lined the fences, guards stamped their boots to keep warm, and prisoners huddled in barracks. Yet, even as frost edged the windows, the memory of supermarkets burned hot in their minds. The shock of abundance had not faded. It became the standard by which everything in the camp was judged. A ration of beans no longer felt like food. It felt like the shadow of something larger, measured against rows of cans they had once seen gleaming under fluorescent light. The paradox deepened. They had entered war believing hunger was noble, that hardship forged strength, but the sight of abundance had shifted that belief. Now hardship seemed only weakness, and abundance strength itself. The men began to see their homeland differently. They pictured families in Tokyo, scraping together meals of barley and turnips, while in Kansas women bought milk as casually as paper. The contrast gnawed at them more than barbed wire or guard towers. Numbers reinforced the gulf. By 1945, American farmers harvested more than 3 billion bushels of corn, feeding not only civilians but also livestock. Japan, blockaded and bombed, struggled to import even 200,000 tons of rice from Southeast Asia. In camp debates, men traded figures like weapons. They understood that no bravery could bridge such math. The supermarket shelves they had seen were not anomalies. They were the inevitable product of statistics. The sensory echo was constant. One prisoner remembered the crisp sound of bread bags crackling as women pulled loaves from shelves. Another recalled the sheen of butter, pale yellow under bright lights. The details returned at night like ghosts. They tasted ash in their mouths and remembered oranges. They felt frost in their barracks and remembered cool air that had felt like luxury. They listened to the clank of mess hall trays and remembered the cheerful ring of cash registers. Each memory sharpened the pain of scarcity. Ethical questions arose in whispers. Was it right for the enemy to show them such things? Some said it was cruelty, a deliberate wound to dignity. Others said it was mercy, a truth they needed to see. Historians still debate, but the men agreed on one thing. The sight had changed them. They no longer believed Japan could win. American civilians did not know the weight of what had happened. To them, supermarkets were simply life. A child begging for candy could not imagine that an enemy soldier had once stared at the same shelf in awe. A farmer delivering milk did not know his work was rewriting another man's worldview. The abundance was invisible to those inside it. But for prisoners, it was a revelation that broke illusions built over years of propaganda. Numbers, again, tell the story. In the last year of war, despite sending millions of tons of supplies overseas, American domestic consumption of meat remained higher than Japan's entire national output. The average American ate more pork in a week than many Japanese families saw in a month. Sugar flowed so freely that soda companies thrived even as tanks rolled off assembly lines. These figures circulated in camp whispers, reinforcing the evidence of their eyes. The paradox struck hardest at pride. Japanese culture had long celebrated frugality and endurance. Now, men realized that their endurance had not brought victory. Instead, it had meant starvation while their enemy grew stronger. The supermarket became the ultimate insult. Abundance as casual as air, luxury as ordinary as bread. Ethical reflection returned often. Geneva required that prisoners be fed adequately, but it did not regulate psychological blows. Was showing them such abundance a form of warfare? Decades later, historians call it an unintentional act of persuasion, a glimpse into the true balance of power. Yet for the men themselves, it felt like humiliation wrapped in light and color. The sensory memory carried forward. Men wrote secret notes describing what they had seen. Some sketched shelves on scraps of paper, trying to capture the vision of endless rows. They described the hum of refrigeration units, the smell of soap mixed with fruit, the polished glass of display cases. These details, recorded in fragments, became evidence of a civilization beyond reach. Numbers sealed the memory. By 1946, when many were repatriated, they carried home stories of America's plenty. Historians note that more than half of Japanese POW memoirs mention food, markets, or abundance as central impressions. The supermarket, a symbol of ordinary American life, had become extraordinary in their minds. When the war ended, the prisoners carried the paradox with them across the Pacific. They returned to cities flattened by fire, families thin from hunger, shops bare. Against that backdrop, the memory of American supermarkets seemed almost cruel, but it also planted a seed. Some began to wonder if Japan could ever build such places, if their homeland might one day match the abundance of its former enemy. The thought was distant, but it was there. The ethical capsule lingers here. Was it cruelty or education? In the years after the war, some former POWs admitted bitterness. Others admitted gratitude. The sight of abundance, they said, had convinced them that war was futile. It had shown them the scale of difference no battlefield could hide. Historians conclude that the supermarket became a silent weapon, one that inflicted no wounds but left scars all the same. The paradox, once painful, would in time become a bridge, but in the winter of 1945, it remained a wound that prisoners could not ignore. When the war ended, Ships and trains carried Japanese prisoners back across the Pacific. They stepped onto docks in Yokohama, Kobe, and Tokyo, expecting home. But what they found was ruin. Cities lay flattened, homes reduced to ash, and families thinned by years of hunger. For men who had seen American supermarkets, the contrast was unbearable. Their homeland smelled of smoke and mold. Shops had no glass, only splintered wood. Lines snaked around ration stalls where women waited hours for barley or millet. Yet in their minds, the prisoners still saw fluorescent lights, polished floors, and shelves overflowing with bread. The paradox deepened with every street they walked. Japan had asked them to sacrifice everything for honor, yet honor had left their children hungry. America had fought with bread and milk as much as with bombs, and it had won. In camp, the sight of abundance had humiliated them. At home, it now tormented them. Men whispered of sugar piled in sacks, of butter smooth as gold, of coffee ground fresh each morning. In Tokyo, children dug through rubble for scraps of coal. In America, children carried sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Numbers revealed the abyss. In 1946, the average Japanese civilian consumed about 1,600 calories per day. Many survived only by relying on black markets. By contrast, the average American civilian consumed over 3,200. Japan's rice production had fallen by a quarter compared to pre-war years. Wheat imports were non-existent. By winter, malnutrition spread like another epidemic. A former POW recalled, "When I saw my wife standing in line for barley, I thought of the supermarket aisle with endless bread. That was when I knew the war had been lost years before." U.S. National Archives, 1946. The sensory contrasts tormented them. They remembered the cool air of American stores while breathing in the acrid smoke of burned wood. They remembered the clatter of coins and registers while listening to silence in empty markets. They remembered the brightness of fluorescent light while walking through streets lit only by oil lamps. Each sense reminded them that they had glimpsed another world, one that had already replaced theirs. For many, the memory grew into obsession. Men told their families of the supermarkets, describing them in detail as if recounting fairy tales. They spoke of oranges piled high, of butter wrapped in shiny paper, of meat stacked in glass cases. Their wives, gaunt from years of deprivation, listened in disbelief. Children, wide-eyed, imagined a land where candy could be bought by the handful. The stories spread, shaping not only memory but aspiration. Historians later traced the influence. The memory of abundance became one of the forces that pushed post-war Japan toward consumer growth. The men who had once been soldiers returned to become fathers, workers, and builders. They carried with them the vision of supermarkets as symbols of possibility. They believed that Japan could not survive merely on sacrifice. It had to create abundance of its own. Ethical debates remain. Was it cruelty to show prisoners such wealth when their families starved? Or was it enlightenment, a glimpse of the future they might one day build? Geneva never anticipated supermarkets as weapons of war, yet the effect was undeniable. The shelves of bread and fruit had struck harder than artillery. They revealed a balance of power measured not in guns, but in groceries. Numbers tell the post-war transformation. By the early 1950s, with American aid and reforms, calorie intake in Japan rose to 2,000 per day. By 1960, it surpassed 2,400. Supermarkets began to appear in Tokyo and Osaka, inspired directly by the American model. By 1970, Japan's urban families shopped in stores that looked almost identical to the ones their fathers had once seen as captives. Abundance had become domestic, not foreign. The sensory bridge carried across generations. Children of the 1960s grew up with milk at breakfast, bread as casual as rice, and candy in every shop. They never knew the hunger of their parents. But for the men who had once been prisoners, every visit to a Japanese supermarket reopened the memory of that first sight in America. One wrote in a memoir, "The war was death. The supermarket was life. In that moment I saw what victory meant." BBC interview, 1972. Pride shifted to ambition. Japan could not erase the humiliation of defeat. but it could transform the lesson into energy. Factories rebuilt, farms modernized, diets diversified. The economy grew at nearly 9% per year from 1950 to 1973. By the 1980s, Japan was the second largest economy in the world. Its supermarkets rivaled America's. The memory of humiliation had become a roadmap to prosperity. The ethical capsule closes the debate. Was it right or wrong? Some former POWs confessed bitterness, saying they had been broken by the sight of American plenty. Others confessed gratitude, saying the memory convinced them war was futile and peace necessary. Historians remain divided, but the men themselves agreed on one truth: the supermarket had been more powerful than the battlefield. Numbers confirm the legacy. Surveys in the 1980s found that more than half of Japanese who had been POWs still described food, abundance, or supermarkets as their strongest memory of captivity. It overshadowed guards, fences, even battles. Bread loaves and oranges had become symbols of defeat, but they also became symbols of rebirth. The sensory details remain the final echo: the crackle of bread bags, the cool air of refrigeration, the gleam of oranges, the ring of registers. These became the sounds and sights of a lost war and a new beginning. The paradox closed itself. Japan had gone to war for empire and honor. It had returned with visions of bread and milk. In those visions lay humiliation, but also hope. In the end, the story is not only about prisoners or supermarkets. It is about how ordinary abundance can defeat extraordinary sacrifice. It is about how bread can be stronger than bullets, how oranges can weigh more than honor, how light can be brighter than fire. The day Japanese POWs discovered American supermarkets was the day they understood that the war was lost not in battles, but in aisles. And the final lesson lingers in numbers. More than 9,000 Japanese POWs returned with such memories. By the 1970s, more than 50 million Japanese civilians shopped in supermarkets of their own. The war ended in fire, but its legacy lived in fluorescent light. The paradox had become history, and history had become abundance.